is authorized to declare recess at any time. Today, the Rules Committee is convening to consider H.R. 27, the Halt All Lethal Trafficking of Fentanyl Act, or Halt Fentanyl Act. Illicit fentanyl and its analogs are responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans every single year. Fentanyl destroys families, upends communities, and poses a serious threat to the health and safety of millions of Americans. For context, in 2022, the DEA seized over 379 million doses of fentanyl. That's enough to kill every single American. And with the open border policies of the previous administrations that are now thankfully being reversed by President Trump, the stream of fentanyl into the United States over the last 4 decades went unimpeded. Something must be done to change the trajectory, and H.R. 27 offers a solution. This legislation would permanently place fentanyl analogs into Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act, simplify registration processes for certain research with Schedule I substances, provide for exemption of individual analogs from Schedule I when evidence demonstrates it is appropriate. Last Congress, the Halt Fentanyl Act received sizable bipartisan support, with 74 Democrats voting yes alongside Republicans. I hope this time around that more of our colleagues across the aisle will join us. Everyone in this room has certainly read stories or seen news coverage of how illicit fentanyl has wreaked havoc upon our country. One life lost to fentanyl is too many. One life ensnared by an addiction to fentanyl is too many. All of us agree to that. Again, this bipartisan legislation offers us the opportunity to make significant headway in addressing a serious issue that continues to affect our nation. I look forward to the discussion on this legislation, and I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. McGovern, for any comments he wishes to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we are here to consider H.R. 27, the Halt Fentanyl Act. As we all know, the opioid epidemic, especially the fentanyl crisis, is a devastating tragedy. It continues to take lives, destroy families, and wreak havoc on communities all across this country. We have to figure out a way to work together to keep drugs off our streets, to prevent addiction, and support those who are struggling with recovery. But for us to have a constructive conversation tonight, I think we need to set the record straight about a few things. Just last week, while some of my friends were at the Trump-Doral Resort in Miami, the Trump administration tried to suspend vital funding that provides Americans benefits that keep them safe, healthy, fed, and afloat. We're talking about freezing things like Medicaid, WIC, Meals on Wheels, and even veterans benefits. Let's be clear, this freeze would have also blocked hundreds of billions of dollars in bipartisan funding for law enforcement, substance abuse treatment, homeland security activities, and funds to specifically combat the fentanyl crisis. And all of this chaos was spun with the help of many Republicans, including some on this committee. State and local law enforcement assistance, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas Program, all on the chopping block. And so I don't want to be lectured about the fentanyl crisis after Republicans tried to blow up the programs that keep it off our streets. Donald Trump made it a priority his first week in office to pardon Ross Ulbricht. This is the guy who was sentenced to life in federal prison for making fentanyl widely available to online consumers. That's right. One of his first acts was to pardon a notorious convicted fentanyl supplier. I don't know, I think there's kind of a disconnect here. You back the blue by pardoning people who beat police officers. You're fighting fentanyl by pardoning an online drug kingpin whose website contributed to fentanyl pouring into our country. Your big idea to lower the deficit is to cut an agency that represents 1% of the federal budget and then give 10 times that amount in tax breaks for those who are well off and well connected. So the people I talk to, those on the front lines of this crisis, expect more of us. They're sick of empty rhetoric. We need comprehensive, evidence-based ideas to tackle this crisis, to prevent addiction, and to keep fentanyl off our streets. Instead, the current leader of the Republican Party is pardoning a guy who let the fentanyl flood in. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Without objection, any prepared statements that our witnesses may have will be included in the record. I welcome our first panel, Representative Griffith and Representative DeGette from the Committee on Energy and Commerce. I remind witnesses that your full statement may be submitted for the record, and we ask you summarize your statement in 5 minutes or less. Representative Griffith, I welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Unfortunately, most members in this chamber know someone who's been affected by the drug overdose epidemic plaguing our country. According to the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2023, there were more than 107,000 overdose deaths that occurred in the United States. These staggering numbers are due in large part to increasing presence of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, which are approximately 100 times more potent than morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin. The lethal dose of fentanyl is just 2 milligrams, or about 4 grains of sand. A loophole that the Mexican cartels use to traffic illicit, or have tried to use to traffic illicit fentanyl into our country, is to change one of the components of the molecular structure of fentanyl to create a fentanyl analog. The cartels did this in an attempt to evade our criminal laws. Right now, fentanyl analogs are considered Schedule I substances, but only because of a series of temporary scheduling orders, which are now set to expire on March 31st of this year. Along with my colleague, Mr. Latta from Ohio, that's why we have introduced H.R. 27, the Halt Fentanyl Act. This bill aims to curb overdose deaths by permanently scheduling fentanyl analogs as Schedule I substances. This will strengthen law enforcement's ability to prosecute fentanyl traffickers and act as a deterrent. The Halt Fentanyl Act also promotes research by improving the registration process to eligible individuals so that they can conduct studies on those substances with appropriate safeguards. In the Energy and Commerce Committee, we have heard testimony there may be as many as 4,800 different fentanyl analogs. Our experts at NIH, FDA, and other research institutions have studied roughly 30 to 40 of those 4,800 analogs. By encouraging research of Schedule I substances like fentanyl analogs, we can better understand how these substances work and how we can prevent potential harmful impacts in the future. And we may even find a better analog than the form of fentanyl that is currently in use. So far, we haven't, but it is possible. Because fentanyl has proven medicinal use, it is considered a Schedule II narcotic. But illicit derivatives of fentanyl, also called fentanyl analogs, currently have not demonstrated medical value. Let me be clear. This bill will have no impact whatsoever on a physician's ability to administer fentanyl in medical settings. HALT that deals specifically with the analogs, not medicinal fentanyl. The Biden administration even released a statement when this bill passed through the House last Congress, stating that they supported permanent scheduling and streamlined research for fentanyl-related substances. We must address this bipartisan issue immediately and not allow the temporary extension to expire. Once fentanyl analogs are permanently placed in Schedule I, Congress will continue to build off this work to continue to address the illicit fentanyl crisis. This is not a bill to fix everything. It fixes one problem. According to a 2021 GAO report, there was a 90% decrease in these fentanyl analogs coming into our country the year they were placed into the Schedule I temporary listing as Schedule I. This bill is a critical step in combating the opioid crisis in our country because China and Mexico are heavily involved in the business. China is sending the precursors of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs to the cartels in Mexico, who then cook it up, formulate it, and bring it into our country across the border. By making these analogs permanently Schedule I, it removes the incentive to traffic these analog forms of fentanyl into our country. China even realized the risk of fentanyl analogs and permanently scheduled these analogs on their strictest schedule. Other countries have followed suit and done the same. Last Congress, this bill cleared through Energy and Commerce on a bipartisan basis and then passed on the floor with 74 Democrats voting in favor of it. The bill has the support of many law enforcement agencies and other entities calling for the need to pass this bill as it is. We must act quickly to make the scheduling order permanent before it expires in just a few weeks. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Representative Griffith. Representative DeGette, you are now recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee and I all want to work with our Republican colleagues to address the opioid crisis that has touched all of our communities. The best way to approach this crisis is through a multi-pronged strategy that includes public safety, public health, and science. H.R. 27, the Halt Fentanyl Act, attempts to solve the issue of emerging drug threats through incarceration only, as this bill doubles down on mandatory minimums for fentanyl-related substances. Last Congress, my Democratic colleagues and I shared our concerns about the partisan approach of the HALT Act. We called for a bipartisan solution, the Save Americans from Fentanyl Safety Act, or SAFE Act, which encompasses both a public safety and a public health approach. Despite the bipartisan solution presented by Representative Pappas, once again, we're retreading the same path that went nowhere in the Senate last Congress. Rescheduling fentanyl as a Schedule I substance will, in and of itself, not prevent one death. The Halt Fentanyl Act does nothing to provide law enforcement or public health agencies with additional resources to detect and to intercept illicit drugs at legal ports of entry. Nor does it provide resources for prevention, treatment, or recovery efforts for those already experiencing substance use disorder. But the majority pushing through the Halt Fentanyl Act shows that they believe that the best way out of this crisis is through incarceration, which simply is not a viable or effective strategy. Additionally, the Halt Fentanyl Act's provision of a class-wide permanent scheduling action for FRS based only on chemical structure sets a dangerous precedent. All other class-wide scheduling orders require an evaluation of a substance's pharmacological effect. Moving forward with the Halt Fentanyl Act curbs this long-lasting precedent and puts us on an unsure path to the future. All of us do agree that FRS do pose a threat to public health, but the DEA has only encountered 37 existing FRSs, and we're still unsure about their pharmacological effects. By implementing this permanent scheduling without off-ramps for FRS, once we have established their effects, we will exacerbate the incarceration rates that we have with the punitive mandatory minimum provision and exacerbate existing inequities in the criminal justice system. But as Mr. McGovern said, that's not the only thing that the administration is exacerbating with their recent actions. Frankly, the Trump administration has withheld important funding to these critical programs that we need to stop fentanyl. The Trump administration's attempt to freeze federal funding last week for critical programs at HHS puts all of our communities at risk of losing the progress that we have made in addressing the opioid epidemic. The irresponsible and illegal attempt to withhold federal grant awards impacts all of our communities, including over $12 million in substance use grants through the CDC, NIH, and SAMHSA in the district of the chair of this committee in North Carolina. Our communities depend on these funds to support proven public health prevention and treatment for vulnerable populations. It's bewildering to me that there are people on this committee who are silently standing by while mental health programs wonder how they're going to pay their providers, hospitals are cutting services, and researchers' funding applications are stuck in limbo. In the OMB memo issued last Monday evening, which ordered the unconstitutional funding freeze, this administration targeted programs including certified community behavioral health clinics demonstration grants. Grants like these are critical as they support clinicians in their efforts to assist with prevention, treatment, and recovery of substance use disorder. Is this also the majority's plan to save America from the grips of the opioid epidemic, starve our communities from opioid treatment help, leave the most vulnerable without services, and those who are valiantly attempting to care for them in their lifetimes? Mr. Chairman, that is why I cannot support this underlying bill in its current form, and I will not sit by and abide our president unilaterally handicapping this body's constitutional rights. I ask the members of this committee to learn from the mistakes last Congress and to not push this partisan legislation through the floor, ignoring calls to work together on bipartisan legislation to address this crisis. Return the legislation to the Energy and Commerce Committee, where we can roll up our sleeves and we can work on a bipartisan, comprehensive solution that will work for all of those suffering. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you for your thoughtful comments, both of our witnesses. I now recognize myself for questions. Representative Griffith, how does this legislation address the issue raised by our Democratic colleagues who believe that the bill would prohibit access to fentanyl for medical purposes or prohibit research?
Yeah, that's a red herring. That is not accurate. The bill specifically excludes out the fentanyl that's currently used for medicinal purposes from being impacted by this bill. So that would not apply. This is only applied to the analogs or the fentanyl-related substances that Ms. DeGette mentioned. So that would not be a problem.
Okay. In looking to the temporary scheduling that's already on the books for these substances, did the pharmaceutical industry, researchers, or any other relevant entities express concern that the scheduling prevented the development of new medicines?
No, particularly because we have the research component built in there so that people can research. If there is a new medicine capable, then there's an expedited ability to get that information to the Attorney General, as the law currently reads, to reschedule. But that's why we wanted to have the research component in there. I felt very strongly about that when we first put this bill in a couple of years ago, that we not have an end, because we may find something that works. So far, they have not. But they might, and so I did not want to preclude that, and so we put it in there that the research would be able to be continued and go forward.
Well, thank you. And finally, within hours of President Trump being sworn in, he signed a series of executive orders to secure our border and deport criminal illegal aliens. As of today, he has brought Mexico to the table and secured a guarantee that they'll send 10,000 troops to the U.S.-Mexico border to stop the flow of people in these deadly substances. Had President Biden responded with the same forcefulness and resolve at our southern border at any point in his 4 years in the White House, would have made a difference in terms of lives saved in communities protected from fentanyl-related substances.
I don't think there's any question. And as I said earlier, this is one piece of the formula. I think too often people want to have big, broad bills that cover everything, and those are even more difficult to pass than something like this. But this bill deals with one specific problem that we saw, and both parties have voted to extend the temporary scheduling of Schedule 1. The problem is that bill, or that temporary scheduling of Schedule 1, doesn't have the research component, but it had the effect, as I said in my testimony, it had the effect of shutting down the attempts to play legal games with bringing in illegal fentanyl by claiming, oh, it's a right-handed molecule instead of a left-handed molecule, therefore you can't charge us. Those games ended with the temporary. This will make it permanent and open up the doors for research.
Excellent. Thank you, Representative Griffith. I appreciate your leadership in this legislative area once again, this Congress. The American people suffered for 4 long years under an administration that time and again refused to take seriously the flood of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl-related deaths were brought into all of our communities, all 50 states, rural, urban, suburban, every socioeconomic corner. Thousands of Americans have died from overdoses. Millions of families have been torn apart. Our towns and our cities have suffered from the blight of crime and homelessness that have grown from this epidemic. Enough is enough, and I'm excited that we're moving ahead with this bill this week, and we thankfully have a president who's willing to use every tool at his disposal to put the health and the safety of Americans first. I'm very proud to co-sponsor this bill with Mr. Griffith, now I will yield the floor to Mr. McGovern for his questions.
Yeah, President Hu just pardoned a drug kingpin. Before I get to my questions, Mr. Gett, did you want to respond to anything?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. McGovern. Two things. First of all, it's incorrect that the Democrats are arguing that the bill would prevent medical research. We're not arguing that. In fact, quite the opposite. We're arguing that enshrining this in Schedule 1 would prevent us from looking at all of the potential effects of this molecular structure. And so we actually think research should continue. But what it would do by putting it in Schedule 1 is it would automatically increase the mandatory minimum sentence without any of the other things I talked about in my opening statement that we need to have to prevent fentanyl and then to have treatment. The second thing that I just want to respond to, the chairman mentioned the short-lived tariffs on Mexico that President Trump tried to impose the other day, and he asked the question of my friend and colleague, Mr. Griffith, about sending 10,000 troops to the border. I would just point out for the record that those 10,000 troops were already at the border because they were requested by President Biden to go to the border. So I know President Trump took credit like he always does, but in fact, those troops were already there under the Biden administration.
Yeah, it sounds like you're trying to save face, but in any event, Mr. Griffith, I want to start by reiterating what I said in my opening. Our fentanyl crisis is a tragedy, and it deserves a serious response from Congress. But I want to ask you about an amendment sponsored by your Republican colleague, Representative Green. It's the same amendment she submitted last year when we considered the same bill. Her amendment would impose a mandatory minimum death penalty on people who traffic fentanyl across the southern border. I think the amendment is likely unconstitutional, and it's certainly not a serious response to our fentanyl crisis. But that aside, I have a few questions for you. We know that the vast majority of fentanyl that is seized, 90%, according to Customs and Border Protection, actually comes through legal ports of entry. The head of the Drug Enforcement Administration recently testified before Congress confirming that the vast majority of fentanyl is coming through legal ports of entry, according to their investigations. And as we know, much of the fentanyl crisis is actually being fueled by drug cartels. You yourself actually said that on, I think, X last week. We know that these cartels are being propped up by U.S. firearms. Democrats actually tried last year to disrupt the smuggling of U.S. firearms across the southern border, and the Republicans blocked that amendment. So here's my questions. I mean, one, would you support an amendment to disrupt the smuggling of U.S. firearms across the southern border?
So the question would be that the cartels are smuggling U.S. firearms out of the U.S. and into Mexico.
We're smuggling firearms.
I'd have to see the amendment, but I'm against smuggling across our southern border, whether it's stuff going from the U.S. into Mexico or from Mexico into the U.S., which is why we need to have our Border Patrol strengthened and have them actually focused on protecting our border. And if you protect it from stuff coming in from the south, you would naturally catch things going from north to south.
Maybe we could find an amendment that you can work with us on to
I'd be happy to look at
smuggling
anything to stop illegal activity on the border.
to restrict the smuggling of U.S. firearms to these drug cartels, which they use to obviously kill people and to intimidate people.
I would say to the gentleman, it would probably be better if we just focused on smuggling and not particular items, but anything that's illegal to smuggle across the border.
Do you support Ms. Green's amendment to impose the death penalty on people who smuggle fentanyl across the southern border? And do you support making it an order?
I haven't thought through that one yet, but my gut reaction is that I always try to take death penalty issues very seriously. I have voted for some increases in the death penalty in my years in legislative bodies, and I take that very seriously, and I think it probably needs to be a standalone bill. But I will take a look at it, and I don't know that I can give you an answer at this moment. I'm sure within the next hour I will have to be determined to do it, but I'm not sure that it applies to this bill. I personally think it's an expansion beyond the scope of what this bill is attempting to do. So I would not think that it would be in order on this bill, but a standalone bill, I would have to evaluate and make a decision on that at a later time.
So does that mean you would not favor making it in order?
I do not favor making it in order because it is not the direction that this bill is going in. What we're trying to do is to make it so that the drug cartels cannot play games with the chemical formula of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs or fentanyl-related substances.
And I just have one other question for you. I mean, while we're on the topic of mandatory minimums, a concept that I find is often counterproductive, unjust, and systemically applied with racial disparities, but do you support increasing mandatory minimums for people who beat cops?
Again, you're asking me something that I don't have in front of me, and I read everything before I make a final decision on it. So let me say this about mandatory minimums. I'm always hesitant on mandatory minimums because I, as a recovering attorney who practiced as a criminal defense attorney for many, many years, I recognize that the judges oftentimes can make decisions based on facts, and every fact pattern is a little bit different. And so I'm hesitant to do any mandatory minimums when they're not necessary. I see this one as a little bit different than what some people might see it, and that is that what we're really doing is just keeping the cartels from playing games with the chemical composition of fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances or analogs. And so we're not actually creating a new mandatory minimum. We're just making sure that if you're trying to play games, you're not going to get away with claiming it's not fentanyl when you and I both know it is.
So if I'm understanding the answer to the question, you do not support increasing mandatory minimums for people who beat cops?
I did not say that.
So you are for?
I would have to materially consider the bill and its full ramifications when I saw that bill. I do not have that bill in front of me
And the
today.
reason why I ask is because the president released from prison and pardoned violent criminals who assaulted police officers. And I actually, appreciate you saying that the people who assaulted police officers on January 6th deserve prison time. Some of your colleagues have refused to condemn the violence against law enforcement that day. So I have one last question for you. Do you support the president's decision to pardon the violent people who beat cops on January 6th?
I did not have every case in front of me, but I would be, I think it is a difficult decision, and I would have had a hard time pardoning people who assaulted police officers on any occasion.
Thank you. I have no further questions. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, is now recognized for his questions.
I thank the chairman. I thank the witnesses for appearing before the committee. I thank the gentleman for bringing this legislation before us. I, too, share your desire to eliminate the ability of not just cartels, but all of those that are moving fentanyl and using the ability to kind of obfuscate and then have the precursors and the things that create fentanyl make it much more complex for our law enforcement and, frankly, result in fentanyl that is far more deadly and is, I think, a key reason for why we've had so many deaths across the country. So I think what you're trying to do here is the right thing to do. And I understand some of the questions that are raised. I just think the bill's pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But I wanted to give the gentleman the ability to expand on that point about you were just alluding to in your questioning the simplicity of the legislation. And just for the record, repeat why precisely you think it's important that we have on Schedule 1 these core components of fentanyl that are currently able to be used to game the system by cartels and illegal actors in the United States.
Yeah, well, what brought the original temporary scheduling into place was the fact that the cartels were trying to argue in court that because the molecule didn't line up exactly with the definition of fentanyl that's used medicinally, even though it would have the same impacts and is a fentanyl-related substance or fentanyl analog, that they therefore were not guilty of as charged. This eliminates that argument, and as we saw from the data, 90% of the people trying to do that was eliminated once we scheduled it temporarily. We need to make that permanent. So they saw a drop in the people who were trying to play games with the formula as soon as we scheduled it as a Schedule 1 temporarily. So we already saw the benefit, but if we let it expire in March, we lose that benefit, and they'll go back to playing that game looking then for a judge who will say, that's not real fentanyl, case dismissed, and then we have somebody who should have gone through the justice system, escaping punishment for having done illegal activity. And this just makes it simple that you don't have to have the exact same molecule, but it has to be a fentanyl-related substance or a fentanyl analog.
Now, fentanyl itself is a Schedule II drug because of its medicinal uses, correct? And so the point here is that we're not moving fentanyl itself to Schedule I.
That is
but
correct.
We're just saying how these precursors or these components can be used illicitly. That's the goal here of why putting it into Schedule I. I think with respect to research, it is my understanding that Schedule I drugs are allowed to have federally approved research, right? So that research is able to proceed, and it's up to administrations to expedite that and move it along as necessary. Is that correct?
That is correct, but this bill does make that process a little bit easier for people who are trying to do medical research on the fentanyl analogs or fentanyl-related substances.
Well, and
I use those terms interchangeably. It's
Sure.
actually defined, I think, as fentanyl-related substances.
I appreciate that. I mean, and I would just note that this matters a great deal. Obviously, I was listening to Derek Maltz, the new DEA administrator, that about why important this is. He's a good friend. I've recounted numerous times in this committee and in the Judiciary Committee the number of people who have died from fentanyl. Of course, all of us are touched by it in every district across the country. I know you are in Southwest Virginia. I certainly am. I mean, Hayes County, Texas, southwest of Austin, we had 6 kids die from fentanyl poisonings in the last school year in the school district in which I live, where my family and I live in Hayes County. And we had many others who had to be resuscitated with Narcan and other situations. And I think we had something like almost 3,000 who died across the state of Texas, fairly significant numbers. So obviously it's really critically important that we move on this, and obviously we're in rapid engagement in trying to push back on the cartels, and they're responding. We're seeing that, and we saw some activity yesterday that some Border Patrol agents sent me, video of cartels literally using drones and bombing themselves with explosives. There was reports today of cartels engagement with the Border Patrol agents and firing on them. Obviously, we've had the president's engagement with the state of Mexico in terms of what's happening with putting more forces on the northern border. Whatever conversations occurred or didn't occur with the previous administration, we're seeing action now that is dramatically reducing the number of people flowing across the border. That's just factually obvious and true. And so now we're down to something like, I think I saw 400 and something apprehensions a day was reported by Bill Melugin just yesterday, which are historic lows and trending in the right direction. I hope we can get that close to zero so that, as you said, we can get Border Patrol focusing on, ports of entry and, making sure that's operating, and then between the ports of entry, stopping the flow of illicit traffic. I would ask the gentleman on the thing about the mandatory minimums, and whether we agree or disagree on mandatory minimums generally. I hear your sensitivity, and me too, about having any kind of like blanket, minimums that pull judgment out of it. Although my experience as a prosecutor on the other side of the table was that you still had flexibility even within the mandatory minimum framework, but in terms of how we applied. But at the end of the day, with the mandatory minimums, wasn't that a response to judges who were effectively walking away from their duty to ensure that criminals weren't put in jail?
That is correct.
I mean, isn't that why they existed?
That is correct, and oftentimes I did find in my criminal defense work that judges would try to figure out ways to ameliorate the mandatory minimum, not to get rid of it, but to ameliorate it. Maybe there was an additional charge that they could put no time on, that kind of thing, if they thought the circumstances made it necessary. But you're absolutely right. The reason mandatory minimums came into existence were judges who were not following the basic tenets of what the legislative body in the various states or in the U.S. had set out.
And your bill doesn't address mandatory minimums. Your bill just creates a framework with respect to the
That is correct.
the components of fentanyl.
That is correct.
And then that would then relate to mandatory minimums under existing law, correct?
That is correct.
So we're not addressing that, right?
That is correct.
The last point that I would just make, there was some commentary on some colleagues on the other side about the, supposedly controversial memorandum issued by the Office of Management and Budget, which was guidance that, has been rescinded. But in light of what was put forward, let's just be very clear, it was a temporary pause. And it was, to the extent that it was permitted by law, it was grant federal financial assistance programs that are implicated by the president's executive orders regarding DEI, climate change, and a lot of the woke agenda, a lot of the things the president put forward, it was designed to ensure that a lot of those programs weren't proceeding. And those programs, for example, we're talking about including dollars that were flowing to through NGOs and through organizations that find those dollars that get to Mexico, that get to the cartels, that get to the flow of human beings and narcotics, fentanyl, through our southern border, that there was dollars flowing from taxpayers through NGOs that was facilitating the very trafficking that we're trying to address in this bill. So I think OMB should be commended for trying to clarify that. The White House should be commended for trying to restrict the flow of American taxpayer dollars through NGOs to those who wish to do us harm, because that is factually occurring and factually accurate. And so I think the president is correct to be doing that, and correct to be aggressive in doing that, and similarly correct in being aggressive at going after U.S. aid funding, which was just blatantly filled with absurd spending. $1.5 million to advance diversity, equity, inclusion in Serbia's workplace and business communities. $70,000 for production of a DEI musical in Ireland. $2.5 million for electric vehicles for Vietnam. $47,000 for a transgender opera in Colombia. $32,000 for a transgender comic book in Peru. $2 million for sex changes and LGBT activism in Guatemala. $6 million for tourism in Egypt. Millions to EcoHealth Alliance, $20 million for Sesame Street in Iraq to promote inclusion, $45 million for DEI scholarships in Burma. I could go on and on and on. It is absurd use of taxpayer dollars. I applaud the president and the White House for going after them, and I appreciate you bringing this legislation before the Rules Committee. I'll support the rule, and I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, and I would first yield to Mr. McGovern for a minute.
Yeah, I would just say to the gentleman who I don't know what you're talking about. First of all, with regard to that freeze, I don't know about the gentleman, but I get calls from hospitals and medical centers in my district that the Medicaid portal was frozen. I got a call from a veterans organization that serves homeless veterans that their payment portal was frozen. So I don't know what thought went into this so-called freeze. Thankfully, a judge put a stay on it and basically called it out for what it was, an overreach. It was unlawful. In terms of USAID, I'm happy to sit down with the gentleman and educate him about the importance of USAID in terms of its efforts to fight hunger, its efforts to promote human rights, its efforts to help combat disease, essentially to keep us safer in this country. And by the way, if you don't like USAID, the president doesn't like USAID, I have a suggestion for him, and that is come to Congress, because we're the ones who actually help establish the program. Come to Congress and if you want to eliminate, vote to eliminate it. Vote to cut the funding. But USAID is an agency that saves lives, fights hunger, and strengthens democracy. It's also an investment in the American people. Now let's talk about what USAID does and why it makes America safer and stronger. USAID fights child mortality. Since 2008, it saved 4.6 million children and 200,000 mothers. You didn't hear the president's press secretary say anything about that because she was just determined to try to diminish the program. And I should say, when kids thrive, families and communities grow stronger. Healthier societies mean more global stability, which enhances our own security. USAID helps fight diseases like malaria and AIDS. Since 2007, it has saved 6 million lives from malaria and helped 9.5 million people get HIV/AIDS treatment. I mean, fighting disease abroad protects Americans at home from pandemics. USAID fights hunger. Feed the Future increases farmer self-sufficiency. Food for Peace reduces hunger dramatically. Each package of USAID food is labeled "From the American People." Both programs are a display of our values and build global goodwill around the world. It helps educate kids. Since 2011, it has helped 52 million kids go to school. Why does that matter? Because education fights extremism, and every kid in school is less at risk of recruitment by terrorist organizations, by gangs and cartels. I could go on and on and on, But I mean, this kind of selective, picking some minor things that my friends can exploit in a way to try to undermine USAID, I think is really offensive. This is a program that does a lot of incredible good stuff for people at risk around the world, people who are victims, whose rights are constantly trampled on by dictators in their countries. We should be proud of this program. We should be proud of the people who work there. And what the president did, what Elon Musk did, what his spokesperson did, I think is offensive. And by the way, I'm going to send the president a copy of the Constitution. Again, if he wants to change USAID, wants to eliminate it, he's got to come here. He's got to come here and do it. That's the way this system works. You know, he's not a king. He's not a dictator, at least yet. He's got to follow the Constitution. I thank the gentlelady.
Okay, thank you. Certainly associate myself with the remarks and the concern that the president is doing by executive order what he is unable to do through our constitutional channels, which is if he does not like a program, he does not like congressionally authorized spending, he can try to work with Congress, but simply issuing these edicts, many of which are illegal and unconstitutional, is not the way to go. But to HR 27, just like every district across this country, my constituents have been gravely touched by this opioid crisis. I appreciate the gentleman's acknowledgement that it's a bipartisan problem, but I do think the gentlelady's observation is well taken, that it deserves a bipartisan solution. A crisis of this scale should be something that Republicans and Democrats can come together on, but that's not what this bill does. It's the same partisan bill that we saw fail to become law almost 2 years ago. It has not appreciably changed. What Republicans seem to want and what this bill is a piece of paper they can wave around to pretend they're doing something about fentanyl, much like the performative tariff war we got to endure a couple days ago, where we saw the tariff war end after the president got assurances that our closest allies are going to do what they already were doing with the Biden administration. At any rate, fentanyl and opioids are a national public health crisis, and we can't solve anything just by using strong language and increasing jail sentences. As Representative DeGette noted, we need to address both the public safety and the public health aspects of this, and there are bipartisan bills that would do that, only the Speaker won't bring them up, so we're stuck with this bill. This bill doesn't do anything about ports of entry or distribution networks. It doesn't do anything to support the DEA or local law enforcement. It doesn't improve our ability to interdict drugs coming into the U.S., and it doesn't do anything to support the evidence-based treatments that have proven successful in reducing opioid deaths in the past 2 years. Because as the president of Mexico correctly pointed out yesterday, until the U.S. addresses the demand for fentanyl here, all the border theatrics in the world are not going to solve that crisis. All this bill is going to do is increase jail time for people struggling with addiction because traffickers already face stiff penalties. And of course, while there's posturing about this bill, the president has tried to freeze federal funds that support local police, substance abuse prevention, state opioid programs, interagency programs that would combat drug trafficking. And while that freeze might have been temporarily stayed, there are still executive orders which have halted research and work at the CDC and NIH that would actually treat and prevent opioid abuse. So it's hard to believe that this bill is a serious attempt to find solutions. It seems to be, yet again, a bill about messaging, a messaging bill that has not been improved or added to since we saw it last. And that's just exploiting a crisis that's killing Americans. So we look forward to a time when we can have a serious conversation about what to do about fentanyl. Democrats have offered a number of amendments that would greatly improve this bill. But until our colleagues are willing to work on solutions, we're just frustrated by sound bites, and we shouldn't be playing political games with people's lives. So I yield back.
Mr. Scott of Georgia is now recognized for his questions.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the chairman and ranking member, and appreciate your thoughtful testimony from both of you with respect to the bill that's in front of us. Mr. Griffith, this is an issue you've worked on for some time,
Yes.
fair to say. And I can tell you're passionate about opioid abuse prevention. Fair to say?
Yes, it is.
In my understanding, doing some research, you had worked on a provision about 7 or 8 years ago that actually we've adopted in Colorado around a program that enables pharmacists, doctors, professionals, licensed professionals to be able to take back unexpired, or rather, unexpired and similar products, pharmaceuticals, opioids, to try to alleviate and ameliorate the crisis. Is that a fair?
That is fair.
And my understanding is that that program actually got adopted into federal law back in 2016 in a bill that Ms. DeGette and you both voted for, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. Is that?
I don't recall the bill, but surprisingly, Ms. DeGette and I often agree on issues like this.
Well, you agreed on this one because it was a common sense program to try to address what is clearly a challenge in our country. You championed it. You got it into this law that was ultimately signed into law by then President Obama. It's an important program that you helped author. I assume you're aware that that program was frozen last week by President Trump.
I understand there was a memo that was sent out by the OMB that temporarily froze a lot of programs, and that was
Including
lifted.
this one.
I was not aware that this one was included, and obviously.
I'm not sure what wasn't included. If you have a better sense of what wasn't included than me, I'm all ears, because hearing from my constituents, virtually every constituent that contacted our office last week in a panic over this unlawful directive that OMB had issued that thankfully a federal judge has now partially stayed. And I guess this isn't a gotcha. I mean, part of the reason why I asked this, Representative Griffith, is you've worked on these issues for a long time.
Yes.
And I'm trying to understand the logic behind authoring legislation and pursuing it when you have no guarantees that this administration will ultimately spend the dollars that are allocated by this Congress for the stated purposes that Congress intends.
I don't think there's any question that the administration will, in due time, and of course this has already been resolved, but in due time we'll follow the law as it is written.
What is due time? How long do we have to wait before them to follow the law?
Well, I think long enough so that they can figure out if all the money that was being sent out, I mean, a lot of us have concerns that in the last 3 or 4 months prior to President Trump being sworn in, a lot of money by a lot of different agencies was shoveled out the door, and was shoveled out the door perhaps inappropriately or improperly. And an incoming president wants to take a look at that. I don't have a problem with that.
Okay, so how long?
It was inartful in the way that it was perhaps
How
done.
long?
Oh, I would say that since they pulled it back, they're taking other ways to look at it. But I would say that we would have to take a look at a number of items, that the administration is going to take a look at a number of
So
items.
you don't have a time in mind?
I don't, and I don't think that they would have, I don't think they will do a blanket
And who makes
freeze.
that rule? You're making that rule?
No.
Who's
no.
deciding that now the
I
Constitution is held in abeyance and the President of the United States, either president of any political party, can come in and basically decree, I'm pausing all federal funding until I decide I'm comfortable?
I think that's part of the executive branch's duty to execute the laws that we've passed. And what they have to do is determine if the monies that have come into the United States are being spent in a manner in accordance with the law. And I think that to execute the laws properly and to do their job as an executive branch, they have to take stock of every dollar that's being spent by the United States to make sure that it is properly authorized. And once they determine that it is properly authorized, then they'll release any concerns or any holds.
I certainly hope that you serve in Congress for a long time, Mr. Griffith, so that you are here when a Democratic president follows your admonition and decides that they're going to unilaterally shut down and freeze federal funding for any hold on, Mr. I let you finish, so I'm going to finish my remarks. To let them freeze federal funding for any program that they so choose for as long as they choose. Because essentially your rule, this rule that apparently Republicans have adopted in the last 2 weeks, has no logical limitation. I've yet to hear a cogent explanation for how you can justify the President of the United States, again, of either political party, deciding unilaterally that they will freeze, that they will impound funds. And I understand that there are Republicans who disagree with the constitutionality of the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 and the rest. I think those arguments are nonsensical, but I understand that some have those arguments. But I don't really understand how you can make these arguments you're making as you are here testifying in support of a bill to create new laws and new programs that I suppose you're just on a hope and a prayer, believing that this president and the people who he surrounded himself with will decide that maybe they'll enforce this, maybe they won't.
Is
Good
that a
luck.
question?
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just say that it's like so many things. That's why we have three branches, and we have the judicial branch. And just like the court decided with pornography, if a executive branch leader, a president, decided to negate the spending in aberration or against the will of Congress, the courts would then make that determination. But to give them a chance to figure out whether or not the money's been spent properly, I think is appropriate. And I think a court would find, just like they did with pornography, you gotta judge each case on its own merits, and that's why I can't give you a time. I can't in some cases it might be a week, in some cases it might be 6 months. But I think that's why we have a judicial branch to sort out that difference between Congress and the executive branch. But I do understand the executive branch having the desire to, if it believes, and I think that they do in this case believe that monies were sent out the door improperly or without lawful authority, and they have time to check into that, I think the courts would give them some time. How much time would depend on each individual case and the complexities therein.
Well, you and I will disagree strenuously on that point. The Congress passed the Impoundment Control Act of 1974 for a reason, and the notion that we're now going to allow the President of the United States to unilaterally impound funds, unilaterally dismantle agencies, and let the courts figure it out, I think is a deeply dangerous approach. And I think it undermines the constitutional fabric that our framers, that James Madison and others write about in the Federalist Papers. I for the life of me, cannot understand, or perhaps understand is the wrong word. I'm disappointed that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle won't stand up for the constitutional prerogatives of this Article I branch of government. Happy to yield to the ranking member.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Nagusin. I thought that was really profound. I just want to echo what you're saying is here we have this bill that we're purporting to say will stop the fentanyl crisis, but it's a tiny little thing that just amends the Controlled Substances Act, and maybe some of it could be used for not, but in the meantime, last week, the Trump administration froze all of these substance abuse acts. It froze the Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinics Act. We just heard that the rural health grantees have told us their money is still frozen. And in Congress we say my dear friend, but it's really true in this situation. But my colleague and friend says in due time the administration will figure it out. So in the meantime, Congress is here. This is one of my pet peeves with being in Congress, is people do this tiny little thing over here and they say they solved a problem, but at the same time, there's this massive problem that the Trump administration has caused with, just relating today, with programs designed to prevent and stop fentanyl abuse. And no resolution in line. So let's just call it what it is. It is an abuse of the congressional system to say that the administration is just going to do whatever they think, and it's going to impact people who are affected by the fentanyl crisis. Thank you for the question.
I couldn't agree with you more, Ms. Teget, and think you articulated well the situation before us. Mr. Griffith, humor me a bit. What agency is responsible, just so I'm clear, with respect to enforcing this bill, the provisions of this bill?
This would end up being DOJ.
DOJ and DEA, right?
Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah, of course, DEA being obviously
Right.
a sub-agency of DOJ. Can the president just get rid of DOJ? Can he get rid of DEA unilaterally? What if he decides that, he sees this bill and says, well, I I don't know, I'm worried about what's happening in the DEA, so I've decided I'm going to eliminate the agency. Does he have the authority to do that?
I think if it's created by Congress, it would require a congressional act.
Okay. We're in agreement there. How about the Department of Education?
Likewise.
Likewise. All right. I look forward to visiting with you on that topic, in particular the latter topic, I suspect sooner than later. So, thank you. I yield back.
Now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Jack.
Well, I just want to start by saying, since President Trump's been invoked over and over in this hearing, I think and for the record, we should note that his negotiating posture over the weekend led to a few new developments from Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau, for the first time ever, is appointing a fentanyl czar. He's going to list cartels as terrorist organizations, and he's going to launch a joint strike force between the U.S. and Canada to combat fentanyl. So I'd like that noted for the record. But I just have one question to Mr. Griffith. You introduced this legislation last Congress. 74 Democrats supported it. Are there any substantive changes from the administration last Congress, or rather from the bill last Congress to the bill today?
There are not.
Well, then I'll just conclude and yield back by noting that 74 Democrats crossed the aisle to join Republicans in passing this legislation out of the House last Congress. I hope more join this Congress, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. We now recognize Mrs. Fischbach from Minnesota.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate the discussion. I always appreciate the fact that the opposition is able to bring a whole lot of other issues in when we're talking about stopping fentanyl. And it takes a lot of creativity to make sure that they are able to talk about, use their talking points to point out some of those things. But I'll just say, on this bill, I'm a co-sponsor. We voted on it last year. I think that is helpful. We obviously need to get fentanyl under control and stop it. It is killing our citizens, and so I appreciate you bringing the bill forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
I'll be brief. You know, I've sat here and listened to really some amazing comments. Abuse of the system. We don't have bipartisanship. I've heard safety of children. I've heard points of entry. Mr. Griffith, you know, when President Biden opened up the border, did you see the numbers that came out that were publicized finally about the children that crossed the border, didn't have parents with them, to the tune of 600,000?
I have seen those numbers.
How is that? I guess my Democrat friends thinks that's safety coming across the border and what they're facing now without parents. I have in my county been to a drug bust where fentanyl was on the table, and finally they made the arrest to get those who produced it out of the state. But if it were left like it was, it killed the 5 million people in South Carolina. And don't you think it's pretty bold action what this president's doing to stop the fentanyl flow by shutting the border down that the Biden administration just would not do? They opened it up. It was unconstitutional. And it just seemed like those children coming across the border they didn't care about it. Lakeland Riley just didn't care about. The hundreds of thousands of poisonings of our young people just didn't care about. And now raise the fine points why they don't like your bill? That's kind of hypocritical, isn't it?
It's hard for me to say somebody's hypocritical without looking into their heart, so I don't know that I can go that far, but I can tell you it's illogical to have the two positions.
Well, you've heard just what I've heard.
I have, and was very concerned when the Biden administration stopped, already let contracts, left equipment there to rust in building the wall, just stopped that outright. I've been very concerned about the Office of Refugee Resettlement. They actually are under the jurisdiction of the Energy and Commerce Committee. It's the only part of the immigration issue that is. And the fact that the background checks that they do are simply a search on the computer to determine if the person they're placing a child with has a criminal background. They're just checking an internet search engine, kind of like People Finder or something like that. And then not doing home studies, not making sure that these people are actually legitimate and proper caretakers of children. If we did that with a child in the United States, there would be criminal action brought. I will tell you that you brought up the children, and it's a passion issue for me, because no matter how they got here, we need to take care of these kids once they're put into our custody. And we basically are shipping them all over the country, or were shipping them all over the country without doing a proper background check and without doing a check to see if they were actual residences there and to see if those were appropriate homes. They started after some push from the Energy and Commerce Committee. The last administration did start to do some virtual inspections of quarters where kids were supposed to be living, but the level of checking on the children who came here without being accompanied by a parent, and the amount of things that we didn't do that led to some of these kids being used in labor situations where they weren't properly supposed to be in the first place has been documented by the New York Times. So yeah, I find it illogical. That's not what this bill's about either. But since we started talking about all these things and all the world problems, we're trying to solve one little problem with this bill. And I grant you, it's not going to solve everything, but it makes it easier for law enforcement to go in, make that arrest, and then have those people face justice without having to argue about whether it was a right-hand molecule, left-hand molecule, or that it was slightly different than what is currently in the law. And with 4,800 potential fentanyl-related substances or analogs, and with only about 30 to 40 of them having been studied, this bill is needed, not just on a temporary basis, but on a permanent basis. But with that many potential analogs out there that might have some benefit down the road, that's why from the very beginning I insisted we have a research component that made it clear and easy to do research to see if there's something valuable out there that can help people who are in pain or are having trouble.
Well, it was multiplied by I don't know what number in 2020 when the border was opened up and the 15 to 20 million people are in here, and the deaths and the fentanyl. What your bill addresses is a drug that is largely has been increased because of the Biden administration letting anybody and everybody across the border. And so I appreciate you putting this up and fully support it. I yield back.
This concludes the questions of our witnesses. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing here at the Rules Committee today. The witnesses are excused. We'll now move on to amendment testimony, and we'd like to welcome Mr. Hernandez, Puerto Rico.
Important, thank you. I'm not a fan of statistics, but sometimes we need them to make a point. Over the past 2 years, more than 1,000 American citizens in Puerto Rico, Puerto Riqueños, have died from fentanyl overdoses. Just last year in San Juan, over 20 people overdosed in a single incident linked to fentanyl, resulting in 8 deaths. Some of these tragedies happened because of fentanyl combined with xylazine, a powerful sedative approved by the FDA for animals. You might be wondering why this is an issue of national concern. The answer is quite simple. Puerto Rico is America's Caribbean border, and it serves as a transit point for drugs smuggled to the U.S. mainland. Stopping the flow of fentanyl and xylazine to Puerto Rico is necessary to stop the flow of these drugs to the U.S. mainland. That is why I have introduced 2 bipartisan amendments supported by Representative James Moylan of Guam and Representative Stacey Plaskett of the U.S. Virgin Islands to address the increasing presence of fentanyl and xylazine in Puerto Rico and across the United States. Amendment 29 would require the Office of National Drug Control Policy, Caribbean Border Counter-Narcotics Strategy, to develop a comprehensive policy strategy to combat drug trafficking in the region. Amendment 30 would direct the Attorney General to submit a report to Congress assessing the use and trafficking patterns of fentanyl mixed with psilocybin in the Caribbean. I respectfully urge the distinguished chair, ranking members, and members of this committee to advance my amendments and ensure they are made in order. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman for coming here to testify. Are there any questions? I have no questions at this time. Yield to Mr. McGovern.
I just want to thank the gentleman for coming, and hope we'll make your amendments in order.
Thank you. And now we recognize, we would start with Mr. Scott.
I don't have any questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Griffith? No questions, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jack?
No questions. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Fishbach?
No questions, but thank you for coming.
Mr. Norman? No questions. Okay. Thank you very much. You're
you.
excused. Without objection, I will insert into the record the statement of administration policy for H.R. 27. Okay. Thank you for appearing, for all of our witnesses for appearing for us today. Seeing no other members wishing to testify on amendments, on H.R. 27, this closes the hearing portion of our meeting. Oh.
Thank you very much. We've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion? Oh, sorry. The chair will be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith.
Madam Chair, I move the committee grant H.R. 27, the Halt Fentanyl Act, a structured rule. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their respective designees. The rule makes an order only the further amendment printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. All points of order against the amendment printed in Part B of the report are waived. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit.
Thank you very much, Mr. Griffith. You've now heard the motion. Is there any discussion or amendment to the rule?
Yeah, Madam Chair?
Mr. McGovern.
I'm going to have two amendments. First one, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order amendment number 32, offered by Representative Magaziner of Rhode Island, which ensures that the Secretary of Homeland Security shall cooperate with state and local law enforcement agencies to interdict and seize firearms being trafficked to cartels that undermine public safety and national security and further fuels fentanyl trafficking into the United States. Madam Chair, as I said earlier, we know cartels are being propped up by U.S. firearms. And when Democrats offered an amendment to H.R. 2 last Congress to actually disrupt the smuggling of U.S. firearms across the southern border, Republicans killed that amendment. So let's forget about the fake concessions that Trump is pretending he was able to get. Enough of the rhetoric and enough of the games. We have an amendment right here to make sure that the administration is making this a priority, and I urge the adoption of the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Is there any further discussion on the amendment from Mr. McGovern? Hearing none, questions on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a roll call.
Mr. McGovern asked for a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy? No. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Griffith? No. Mr. Griffith, no. Mr. Jack?
No.
Mr. Jack, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. Ledger-Fernandez? Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair, no.
The clerk will report the total.
1 yea, 9 nays.
The noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments or discussion?
I have one final amendment, Madam Chair. I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make and order amendments number 10, 11, 13, 15, 18, and 35 to H.R. 27, which would collectively prevent the underlying bill from taking effect until certification that no covered executive action freezes, reduces, impairs, delays, or otherwise interferes with timely funding for state opioid response grants, substance use prevention block grants, and the Drug-Free Communities Program and other critical programs. Madam Chair, a host of Republicans applauded when President Trump moved to freeze money for COPS grants to help protect our communities. They stood up in support when Trump was going to stop funding to support high-intensity drug trafficking areas, as states were suing the administration to ensure that they had the resources to combat fentanyl trafficking and organized crime. And they posted praise on Twitter when Trump was rolling back funding for the ONDCP drug-free community programs to keep drugs out of our schools. And I don't want to hear that everything's okay because Trump stopped the freeze, because he didn't. A judge issued a temporary restraining order because they were concerned the administration was disingenuous. If we actually want to end fentanyl, the fentanyl epidemic, these amendments will get us closer. It'll hold Trump to his word that money for behavioral health centers, treatment and recovery block grants, and high-intensity drug trafficking areas programs, and more, continue flowing to the law enforcement officers, healthcare providers, and communities who need it the most. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, the question's on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment's not agreed
It
to.
sounded closer. I want to ask for a recorded vote.
You want what?
Ask a recorded vote, please.
Mr. McGovern asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach? No. Mrs. Fishbach, no. Mr. Norman? No. Mr. Norman, no. Mr. Roy? No. Mr. Roy, no. Mrs. Houchin? No. Mrs. Houchin, no. Mr. Langworthy? No. Mr. Langworthy, no. Mr. Scott? No. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Griffith? No. Mr. Griffith, no. Mr. Jack?
No.
Mr. Jack, no. Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez? Madam Chair?
No.
Madam Chair, no.
The clerk will report the total.
1 yea, 9 nays.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Any other further amendment or discussion? Hearing no further discussion, the question is on the motion from the gentleman from Virginia. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Ask for a roll call, Madam Chair.
Mr. McGovern asked for a roll call. The clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Fishbach? Aye. Mrs. Fishbach, aye. Mr. Norman? Aye. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. Roy? Aye. Mr. Roy, aye. Mrs. Houchin? Aye. Mrs. Houchin, aye. Mr. Langworthy? Aye. Mr. Langworthy, aye. Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Griffith? Aye. Mr. Griffith, aye. Mr. Jack?
Aye.
Mr. Jack, aye. Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. Leisure-Fernandez? Madam Chair?
Aye.
Madam Chair, aye.
The clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 1 nay.
Ayes have it. The motion to report is agreed to. Accordingly, Mr. Griffith will be managing the rule for the majority.
And I will do it for the,
Mr. McGovern will handle it for the minority. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.